Everyone loves a good deal. That's why game companies have been bundling popular titles together since decades ago. Today, compilations of classic games have become some of the most reliable and accessible methods of exploring the history of various series and publishers. But sometimes you'll find a classic game included with a brand new game as a bonus. These extras may be listed as a bullet point on the back of the box, but are generally not presented as a selling point that overshadows the main game. Let's take a closer look at some of these games within games, because it's easy to forget that some of these were even there in the first place. Heck, you never know. Maybe we'll discover some of the best ways to play some of the most significant games in history. Or maybe some of the worst.
Developers have been sneaking in extra games for a long time. In an age where most games can be downloaded in seconds to play on real hardware or emulators, it can be easy to forget that it used to be pretty novel when an extra game was included as a bonus. After all, most were once full-price games themselves, so it felt like a really huge deal to get them for free. We're going to be looking at a whole bunch of these types of games in this episode, but what exactly is our criteria that justifies a game within a game? I'm guessing that many people thought of Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt when they first saw the title of this episode, but both games are given equal billing on the package. We aren't counting any games that are specifically labeled as collections or compilations. Others may have thought about the battle game in Super Mario 3, which can be directly accessed from the Mario 3 title screen in Super Mario All-Stars. This may look like the Mario Bros. Arcade game, but in practice, it's just too different to truly consider it the same game. It's just a mini-game. A pretty fun one, though. The same can be said for the Gradius game in Mystical Ninja, or Fantasy Zone in Arnold Palmer Golf. At a glance, these look like the originals, but they're radically reduced. Only one tiny level each, so they're just fun Easter eggs. Super Mario Bros. Deluxe on the Game Boy Color gets close with its Super Mario Bros. For super players, which is essentially Super Mario 2, aka The Lost Levels. But it's incomplete. Graphical and mechanical alterations aside, Worlds 9 and A through D are not present, so we wouldn't really consider this a suitable replacement for the real thing. That said, the kind of examples we'll be looking at can be summed up nicely by Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure. This 1994 sequel/revival features incredible animation and it was released on just about every console at the time. By entering a button code at the title screen, you can relive the influential Atari 2600 Pitfall adventure, which is visually faithful. I mean, that shouldn't be that hard, but the sound isn't exactly the greatest. Unfortunately, the original Pitfall seems to have been omitted from the 2001 Game Boy Advance release. Hidden games are good and all, but probably the most common occurrence of games within games is as a reward for beating a game's story mode, or overcoming certain challenges along the way. One of my favorite examples of this is in the Ninja Gaiden reboot on the Xbox. Hidden throughout the story mode are the original trilogy of games. Except these aren't the NES versions as you'd expect. For some reason, Team Ninja decided to include the Super NES remakes that were part of Ninja Gaiden Trilogy. This was maybe not the greatest choice, but it's certainly an interesting one, and I can appreciate that. These games are definitely inferior to the NES entries in just about every aspect, most notably in the sound department. The melodies just didn't seem to jive with the SNES's sample-based sound. Despite that, the game supports 480p, and so do these versions. Everything appears to be scaled correctly with no scrolling shimmer that I noticed. Although the color in each game does appear to be slightly desaturated, it works in their favor, giving them sort of a look akin to the original non-one-chip SNES console. The presence of passwords were a nice quality-of-life addition to the SNES games, and by extension, here as well. These games are of decent length, so having them incorporated here is quite welcome. This trilogy was removed from the release of Ninja Gaiden Black, and replaced with a vastly inferior arcade game. I'd love to show that to you as well, but I don't have a save with it unlocked. Regardless, The arcade game is a step down from the NES trilogy in just about every respect, making this a compelling reason to own both Ninja Gaiden Black and the original release. Not to mention, none of these bonus games make an appearance in the PlayStation 3 Sigma release. Not all these are within the game itself. There's several instances where the developer has bundled a bonus disc with an additional game on it in the package. The US release of Strider 2 on the PlayStation 1 included the arcade game on its own disc. When most people address this release, it's always about how the disc art was reversed. Strider 2 was on a disc labeled Strider, and vice versa. While this is a fun anecdote, what they should be really talking about is how this is essentially the best version of the first Strider to ever be released on the home market. Built from the ground up from scratch, it's supposedly an arcade-perfect port with all the animation and music intact. The only real downfall being a loading screen between each level, which isn't even that big of a deal in the first place. After you beat the game, you gain access to a number of bonus options, such as remixed music and the ability to customize Strider Hiryu with different colored outfits. It seems like there was a lot of love put into this port, and the additions make it more than just a simple arcade conversion. Now that you have a better understanding of what we're looking for, let's take a look at how Nintendo's taken advantage of their classic titles over the years.
Walnuts, peanuts, pineapple smells, grapes, melons, oranges, and coconut shells.
By the late 90s, game consoles had become capable enough to emulate classic games, so it wasn't uncommon to see developers dig into their back catalogs to include nice little bonuses without having to fully port their older games to new hardware. With a rich history of releases to draw from, Nintendo began to dabble in including some of their older games with new releases. Donkey Kong 64 is one of the N64's most massive games. Rare's attempt to convert Donkey Kong Country into a 3D platformer pushed the limits of attention spans by packing the world full of so many collectibles that finishing the game can take more time than an RPG. Among the game's many bonuses are two important titles from both the histories of Rare and Nintendo. Ever the vocal advocate for the earliest generations of gaming, Cranky Kong will begin to challenge the player to beat his high score in Jetpack after a certain point in the game. In fact, doing so is required to even finish the main game. Jetpack was developed for the ZX Spectrum by brothers and Rare co-founders Tim and Chris Stamper, their first game released under their previous company name, Ultimate Play the Game. The game is actually represented quite cleanly in DK64, especially with Ultra HDMI mod as shown here. Jetpack has also been remade and emulated on Xbox platforms, but this remains the game's only official appearance on Nintendo hardware. The original Donkey Kong can also be found in DK64's Frantic Factory level. As with Cranky Kong's Jetpack Challenge, the rewards for finishing Donkey Kong must be collected to beat DK64. This version is notable for actually being based on the original arcade release, which Nintendo has only sparsely republished over the years, instead favoring the NES port, which is lacking the arcade game's second level, the Cement Factory. The vertical scaling is a bit off here compared to Jetpack, which is most apparent when Mario is riding an elevator in Stage 3. The sound is also a bit muffled and distorted, but I like to think that's a conscious artistic choice. So, with the N64, it was starting to become viable for Nintendo to use emulation commercially. A number of these early emulation experiments would continue to appear over the course of the early 2000s. Now, a few of these, like the Ocarina of Time and Master Quest Collection and the Zelda Collector's Edition, were given away in separate packages as pre-order and registration incentives, so I don't think we can really count those, but other examples of emulation did appear as bonuses in the games themselves. Dobutsu no Mori, or Animal Forest, is one of the last games released for the N64 in Japan, a strange new concept of a communication game that at the time seemed like a gamble. Of note, a handful of Famicom games could be acquired for play in the player's house. The GameCube port, titled Dobutsu no Mori Plus, was localized as Animal Crossing for Western markets and includes several more Famicom games. These appear as NES consoles in the overseas versions and can be obtained through various means. Unfortunately, most of these don't represent the NES's finest work, consisting primarily of very early black box titles. But, you know, even if these aren't my favorite NES games, they were absolutely the most exciting items to find in the game, at least to me. One outlier to the early NES theme is Wario's Woods, possibly my favorite puzzle game of all time, which can only be found on the Game Boy Advance Link Cable Island. The GBA connection could also be used with the e-reader to acquire a couple of other games, but sadly it looks like I never ended up with those in my card packs. You could even load up the games for play on your GBA independent of your GameCube years before the classic NES series cartridges hit the system. A handful of more exciting games are hidden in Animal Crossing's code, including Punch-Out!, Super Mario Bros., and The Legend of Zelda, which were reserved for Nintendo giveaways, although we've struggled to find any concrete info on this, and internet hearsay suggests that the Zelda giveaway never happened. I haven't tried it myself, but it seems like all games can be obtained through the use of a cheat device like an Action Replay. Now, speaking of playing NES games on the GameCube and Game Boy Advance, Nintendo made sure that no one with these systems was lacking for options to play the original Metroid. After being missing in action for a generation, Samus made her triumphant return in November 2002 with two new games: the daring first-person Metroid Prime on GameCube, and the sprite-based Metroid Fusion on Game Boy Advance. Ironically, it was Metroid Prime that more closely adhered to the series formula, but after being Metroid Fusion, it's possible to unlock the original Metroid on GameCube by connecting Fusion to Prime via the link cable. Unfortunately, this version puts jump on B and shoot on A, and that just ain't right. I mean, I get why they did it, since those are the controls in Metroid Prime, but it feels real bad for an NES game. Metroid is also playable on the GBA system itself with Fusion's follow-up, Metroid Zero Mission, which is itself a reimagining of the NES original. Metroid is unlocked by simply beating Zero Mission. Of course, compromises are inevitable whenever shrinking down 240p games to the 160p GBA resolution, but no matter how you play it, the original Metroid is still fun if you can get your head in a place where you can enjoy the challenge of an open world with no in-game map. Another classic Nintendo game is included with a rather unlikely title, Fight Night Round 2 by EA Sports. To be honest, I could not figure out how to play this game at all. It just feels unresponsive to me. But you know what boxing game does feel great to play? How about we switch over to Super Punch-Out instead? Now this is more like it. But unfortunately, the sound emulation is some of the worst I've ever heard. Still, the game is playable enough. Super Punch-Out may not be as popular as Mike Tyson's Punch-Out among the general populace, but it's an excellent sequel that should be played any way you can get your hands on it.
Sega went third party in the early 2000s, they had a whole new audience that had never played some of their games. However, they knew they had to have some sort of hook to ease the older fans into this brave new reality. In a show of good faith, Sega added new content to many of their ports. On the GameCube, Skies of Arcadia Legends added new story content, while Sonic Adventure 2 supplemented the lengthy campaign with a new 2-player battle mode. When they finally got around to the first Sonic Adventure, Sonic Team dropped in a slew of Game Gear Sonic games for players to toy with. Getting most of these unlockables is pretty easy if you just play through the main adventure normally, triggering as you hit certain emblem milestones. There's 12 games total here, giving you a complete list of portable Sonic games in one fell swoop. Sonic Adventure supports 480p, and these games tend to look pretty good. Since Game Gear games are natively 160 by 144, it would look a bit too narrow on a TV, so Sonic Team decided to stretch these a bit wider horizontally. Because of this, you get a bit of shimmer on the horizontal axis, but it's not too bad. Most Sonic games are so fast that you'll never even notice this. It only becomes apparent when you slow down. Outside of that, these games are generally emulated pretty well. The enormous borders have been cropped out, and the PSG sound is fairly accurately reproduced. The only egregious issue that really stuck out to me was that Tails Adventure was insanely dark for some reason. If you go to the main option menu and switch the language to Japanese, the Game Gear ROMs will also switch over to their Japanese counterpart. That's a neat little bonus, and a cool subversion of my expectations. Sonic games felt right at home on a console like the GameCube, but over on the Xbox, Sega was delivering some graphically intense sequels in the form of Jet Set Radio Feature, and more importantly, Panzer Dragoon Orta, which, I'm just saying, is my favorite game on the system. This is a game that is absolutely packed with bonus features, like artwork, minigames, and an entirely separate extra campaign. But if that wasn't enough, when you finish the main game, you can open up the entire original Panzer Dragoon, which is kind of insane, considering that it only just came out during the previous generation. The version included here is a port of the PC version instead of the Saturn original, which makes sense considering the Xbox hardware's closer relation to that environment. Whether or not this is a good thing depends on what you're looking for. A number of graphical flourishes, such as the water in the first stage, has been altered. Like the main game, it'll run at 480p if you're playing on an Xbox that supports it for this game. Although keep in mind that it has a strictly 4:3 aspect ratio, while the main Orta game supports 16:9. So don't forget to set your TV to the correct aspect ratio. But perhaps the most obvious hit against this version is the heavy filtering of the entire game, making it look really soft and blurry compared to the original. Of course, in 2002, this sort of approach was commonplace when it came to emulating or porting older games to newer hardware. The anti-dithering crowd won't mind it at all because this helps to smooth out some of the heavy dithering present, most apparent in the view cone in the HUD. Being an exclusive S-tier game on the system, it's no shock that Panzer Dragoon Orta was selected to be among the games that were made backwards compatible on not only the Xbox 360, but in spectacular 4K 60 on the Xbox One X. Playing Orta in 4K really drives home just how timeless of a game this is. The art direction holds up extremely well, and just about every frame looks like a painting. But how does the unlockable original fare in this new version? Well, for a PC port running on an Xbox, which is in turn running on an Xbox One, it's not bad at all. No increased frame rate here. In fact, the higher resolution almost gives the impression of it being a lower frame rate than the original. but it's not glitchy or anything, at least that I've seen. The only real catch here is that it's forced to 16:9 due to the 4K upscale. Now, to be fair, this doesn't exactly destroy the integrity of the look, but considering the stellar work of Microsoft's backwards compatibility team up to this point, part of me was hoping that the proper aspect ratio would be retained. Alright, so how about Sega's arcade games? Prolific game designer Yu Suzuki included a number of his superscalar games in Shenmue that not only aided with the mid-80s immersion, but also gathered some of the most influential games of all time under one roof. Sit down and give them a shot, for 100 yen per play.
Guess I'll try it.
Hang On was the first superscalar game released, and while it's often overlooked in favor of its sequel, Super Hang On, its influence cannot be denied. Being present in Shenmue makes sense because Yu Suzuki directed the first game, while he only served as producer for the follow-up. Also, this is one of, if not the only officially released arcade-accurate port of the original game. The other 3 games that appear across Shenmue are Space Harrier, Outrun, and Afterburner. These are cornerstones of Sega's arcade history that have been re-released and ported all over the place. On the Dreamcast, I was pleasantly surprised to see that Space Harrier, Outrun, and Afterburner all output at 240p. Although they do seem to be a touch darker and desaturated than I'd like. Still, this is pretty great if you're after something a bit more authentic. Unfortunately, Hang On seems to be 480i, and I'm not quite sure why. However, all 4 games do support progressive scan through a VGA box or 480p capable cable. This will help with a lot of HD TVs, but if you have a DC HDMI mod installed in your Dreamcast, dang, these games look razor sharp. Shenmue 2 was later ported to the original Xbox in 2002, with the same games in tow. Since the Xbox doesn't officially support 240p, all these games are forced to either 480i or 480p depending on your video output settings. The overall image has been brightened up a bit, and the audio has been tweaked to sound a bit fuller. Everything remains pretty sharp, with Hang On being a touch softer than the others.
Checkpoint.
But how about the Shenmue 1 and 2 HD re-release? D3T handled these remasters to decent results overall, after a healthy dose of patches. I was curious to see how well the arcade games would be emulated here. I'm assuming that both games use the same emulation in this package, because they generally look the same. However, there are certain aspects that make me unsure if that's the case. The first game puts some reverb on certain sound effects, making them sound like they're inside of a real arcade.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
While these are appreciated, they don't seem to be present in the second game.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
Hang On looks to be a 4x scale of the original and is ultra sharp. The others look as though they're 4.5x scales, which isn't pixel perfect, but it doesn't cause any major shimmering issues due to the Z-axis perspective. Unfortunately, none of these games are going to be playable in Shenmue 3, which is understandable, but a bummer nonetheless. Still, chances are if you're a big fan of Shenmue, then you're most likely familiar with the series that picked up and carried its torch in more ways than one.
Get ready.
The Yakuza series has resonated with gamers of all types ever since the original entry on PS2, and Sega has been more than happy to provide hungry fans with more. Now, I have to admit, the grand scale of the ongoing story has intimidated me for years. That is a lot of game to get through. So I took the 1980s prequel, Yakuza 0, as a way to give the series a taste test. While Yakuza is considered by many to be a spiritual successor to Shenmue, I prefer to liken it to River City Ransom, an open world that is equal parts serious and goofy, where you beat up punks, money flows, and fast food is your never-ending source of strength. But one cue it most certainly takes from Shenmue are its Sega arcades. Famed emulation developer M2 has long handled the series' arcade titles, and I had a great time playing Space Harrier and Outrun in Yakuza 0. But other entries in the series even include games like Puyo Puyo and some of the Virtua Fighter games. The Yakuza team has a habit of sneaking classics into other games they've developed, such as Fist of the North Star, Lost Paradise, in which you can find many arcade games scattered across the wasteland.
Let's ride. Hang on!
You can even use a Sega Master System in Kenshiro's apartment that plays one of the very earliest Fist of the North Star video games. This is the first time that this version has been released outside Japan with the Fist of the North Star license. It was previously localized as Black Belt and was quite a different game. I just love how the enemies explode. The technical wizards from German-American development studio Factor 5 built their brand on the Turrican franchise, but rose to higher prominence with their technically impressive and critically acclaimed Star Wars titles for N64, PC, and GameCube. Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader was a miracle of a third-party launch title for the GameCube. It included both the battles of Yavin and Endor, leaving few ideas for a potential sequel. As such, Rogue Squadron 3 Rebel Strike was released in 2003 to a more tepid reception that was further marred by unimpressive on-foot gameplay. Nonetheless, Rebel Strike offers a trio of enticing bonuses, emulations of the classic Star Wars arcade games. Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back are unlocked through normal progression in the game's main missions. Both were originally designed for vector monitors, so 480p on the GameCube can't really replicate the true look. It's a bit dark. But still, this is a convenient way to play these impressive early 3D titles.
Prepare to make the jump to light speed. I want that ship, not excuses.
The Return of the Jedi arcade game is unlocked by entering a password.
Here goes nothing. Now locked onto the strongest power source. It should be the power generator.
Rampage Total Destruction was developed by Foundation 9 and released for the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Wii in 2006. This is a polygon-based interpretation of Midway's classic Rampage series, and like its predecessors, there's not much to it. But if you're looking to shut off your brain and indulge in some mindless mayhem, you could certainly do worse. But if you prefer the older titles, Total Destruction also offers emulations of the original Rampage and Rampage World Tour. Fittingly, the emulation is handled by Digital Eclipse, which was at the time a part of Foundation 9. The first game is a slow-paced 1986 arcade title, while World Tour is a much faster game, which I definitely prefer. The scaling is far from perfect, although in the case of World Tour, the graphics' general softness seems to prevent visible shimmering. Certain elements of the graphics of both games appear to be drawn at a higher resolution, so I wanted to see what would happen if I forced 480p using the GameCube homebrew utility Swiss. Interestingly, booting each game from the title menu after forcing 480p resets the output to 480i. But Swiss can also directly access two other boot launchers on the disc, both of which display an extremely interesting list of games. Unfortunately, none of them actually load aside from the Rampage titles, but booting from this menu was the only way I was able to use 480p with the arcade titles, at least on GameCube. Contra 4 by WayForward is perhaps the best action game for the Nintendo DS. A supremely satisfying run and gun from a team that simply knows how to make a game that looks, sounds, and plays as Contra should. Fittingly, two of the NES classics that inspired Contra 4 are included as unlockables for clearing missions in the game's challenge mode. The NES version of Contra is one of the best 8-bit games ever made. and while there are some noticeable audio hiccups and neither of the scaling options available can really make up for the DS's screen being a bit too low res for NES games, the fact that this game was included at all ended up being quite significant. That's because following Contra 4, Konami failed to re-release the NES Contra on any of Nintendo's Virtual Console platforms or even the NES Classic Edition, and its scarcity on modern platforms has been a real shame. It wasn't until the Contra Anniversary Collection that the game finally re-emerged. Contra 4 also includes the NES version of Super C, a solid sequel that's just a bit less classic. This is the game that Konami has consistently used to represent the series' NES era on Virtual Console and on the NES Classic Edition in lieu of Contra 1, which has probably made some fans a bit bitter. But in spite of imperfect emulation, NES games being playable on the DS was a nice novelty in 2007. When it comes to packing games full of extras, one developer that immediately comes to mind is Namco. Especially during the PlayStation 1 and 2 eras, they really set a standard for unlockables that has perhaps never quite been matched since.
I already mentioned Panzer Dragoon Orta's crazy list of unlockable content earlier in the episode, but when it comes to sheer amount of bonus material, no developer delivered more consistently than Namco on the PlayStation 1 and 2. Ridge Racer was the first game that gave Sega a real challenger when it came to racing game dominance. And a sign of things to come, the PS1 featured a mini version of Namco's arcade classic, GLACIES, as a way to help players pass the time during load screens. Before the development of Ridge Racer Type 4, the team behind it did extensive research on just how viable 480i 60 frames per second would be for a new game. Although the PS1 version of Tekken 3 was able to achieve this, R4 was just going to be too much for the hardware. Instead of letting this research go to waste, they put the tech to good use in an enhanced version of the first game called Ridge Racer Turbo Mode. With R4 being the final entry on the PlayStation 1, Namco included Turbo Mode on a bonus disc in the same package, putting a nice bow on the first generation of Ridge Racer. The higher res makes it look especially crisp on a CRT, and the higher frame rate is immediately apparent. What's cool is they also included a pared down version of the original, non-turbo Ridge Racer on the same disc, so you can observe just how far development improved over the system's lifespan. Tekken 5 arrived on the PlayStation 2 in 2005, just in time to celebrate the series' 10th anniversary. In order to put a cap on the series that was always pushing the PlayStation hardware, Namco went all out with the bonus content here. Taking a cue from the PS1 release of Ridge Racer, you can play an arcade game during the loading screen. This time, it's the 1991 first-person rail shooter, Starblade. While the loading screen just gives you a taste of battle, the entire game can be unlocked and is playable in the arcade history section. Believe it or not, this was the first time that an arcade-accurate version of Starblade made its way to home consoles. There were other versions on the Sega CD and other disc-based consoles, but nothing remotely as close as this. Filling out the rest of Tekken 5's arcade history is not only the arcade version of Tekken 1, but Tekken 2 and Tekken 3. Although I'm sure that some fans were sad that they're the arcade versions and not the PS1 ports, but come on, this is an insane lineup here.
Round one, fight!
first two games even display at an accurate 240p, while Tekken 3 is obviously at 480i like it should be. Although I'm not super experienced with these games, I feel like they run exceptionally well here. The level of care that went into representing and preserving these versions is admirable and fills out a great package, both when it was released and now. But on the other side of the coin, you've got something like this. Back in 1989, Konami struck gold with their 4-player Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game. So when Konami got the license back in 2003 to make games based around the then recent cartoon reboot, I was excited to see what they'd do with it, even though I had no interest with the show. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Three new games followed, and to say these didn't live up to expectations would be an understatement. But there was a silver lining. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 Battle Nexus had the original 1989 arcade game as an unlockable, hopefully giving me an arcade-perfect version at home that I'd always dreamed of. While this version looks and plays about how I'd expect for 2004, the real problem lies in the audio. Due to licensing issues, all the voices have been removed, which I suppose does make sense. But the music is all gone too. They replaced it all with a single music track that is used on every single level. And it's horrible. It just doesn't work at all for this version of the game. The combination of the removed voices and replaced music absolutely decimates the experience of this game, making it feel oddly empty and lifeless. The following year, Konami bundled Turtles 2, Turtles in Time as a bonus with TMNT 3 Mutant Nightmare, which fares significantly better. But because the Super NES version of Turtles in Time is so good, if not better than the arcade, the allure of owning this version isn't quite as strong. It doesn't have the original soundtrack, but at least each stage has different, more appropriate music. Voices are also changed, but it seems to be a re-recording of the same lines, although the acting quality is exceptionally bad.
Hey, Krang, bring that statue back, you bloated beanbag.
Hey, Krang, bring that statue back, you bloated beanbag.
Both of these Turtle games are, disappointingly, 480i only, even on the Xbox. Forcing the 480p using GSM on the PlayStation 2 does work and naturally looks much better. I didn't have the GameCube version on hand to test with Swiss, but I would expect similar results.
You silkheads are dead.
When I graduated high school, I spent a few years working for Electronics Boutique. While I was busy enjoying Castlevania Symphony of the Night and Final Fantasy VII, a coworker was obsessed with getting the most out of his PC and 3D accelerator cards to get the best possible experience playing Quake 2. His enthusiasm eventually rubbed off on me, and suddenly I was spending way too much money upgrading my computer with a Voodoo 3 so that I could play, you guessed it, Quake 2. Years later, I had an itch to revisit Quake 2, and after searching for ways to play it on newer hardware, I discovered that there was a little-known Xbox 360 port bundled with the special edition of Quake 4 from around when the console launched in 2005. As it turns out, this is a pretty amazing version of the game, and is self-contained on its own DVD to boot. And a paper sleeve, sure, but I'll take it. And get this, not only is this version in 1080p, but it also runs at 60 frames per second, which isn't even something that the Xbox 360 really had the ability to do until years after release. It's gorgeous, silky smooth, and never seems to drop frames or slow down at all. These days, it's refreshing to play a first-person shooter driven by simplicity. No melee attacks, kill streaks, or even having to reload. Revisiting Quake 2 has been a complete joy. Of course, some people will find the idea of playing Quake 2 with a controller absolutely blasphemous. There was a time when I'd be right there along with them, but the fact is, I don't have the patience or the desire to sit at my PC and play games with a mouse and keyboard these days. And get this, there's even an option for networking and split-screen deathmatch for up to 8 players. I don't have anybody to play it with, but it's pretty cool they put that in there. So, sure, Quake 2 was around 8 years old by the time that the Xbox 360 version released, but to think that this optimized console version has been available for almost 15 years now makes me feel silly for not finding it sooner. So while a classic game being included as a bonus with another doesn't always guarantee a home run, it's always interesting to see the adjustments or concessions that developers had to make. While this is obviously just a small sampling of games within games that have been released over the years, there's a ton of notable ones that we'd feel silly for not mentioning. So maybe we need to return to this subject in the future.